Blazing Tim, and welcome to part 1 of Setting the Stage for the California Gold Rush. What does Andrew Jackson have to do with something that started 20 years later? Well, he set the stage for Alta California to break away from Mexico and become part of the United States. How do we go from this, with all the gray land, to this? Well, the story of turning all of that Mexican territory to America includes paying off the entire national debt, the bankruptcy of 8 states, Mexico refusing to sell land for up to $45 million, and eventually to war. All of that in 10 years. Those 10 years, from paying off debt to war, are very colorful. So, let's learn from history. This video series covers the periods before and after the California Gold Rush. In part 1, we're looking at the election of Andrew Jackson, including the Georgia Gold Rush and Texas independence. In part 2, we'll be looking at free banking and the Panic of 1837. Part 3, we'll look at the election of James Polk, the Mexican-American War, and Manifest Destiny. Part 4 is all about the end of the gold rush and economic collapse when the Panic of 1857 occurred. So, let's get to it. This is the United States at the beginning of Andrew Jackson's presidency. California was still part of Mexico, and so was Texas, and all that land in between. In the next 20 years, all of that gray land and all of that would change. To look at Andrew Jackson's presidency and 2 of the key events during his tenure, the Georgia Gold Rush of 1828 and Texas's independence from Mexico in 1835. To get started with Andrew Jackson, you need to know that there was so much drama in his life and his presidency. It starts off simple, though. He had humble roots from North Carolina, where he was born in 1767, before the War for Independence. He ended up becoming a trained lawyer, and he ended up making a lot of land investment in Tennessee. He would buy land when it was still cheap, and then sell it much later at a great profit. He was a very public servant. He ended up becoming Tennessee's first representative to the House of Representatives. He was elected to the Tennessee Superior Court through his background as a lawyer, and he was later a U.S. Senator. He was also using his connections and became an officer in the military and ended up a general and ended up being very influential and successful. He won the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the War of 1812, and he led the First Seminole War in 1817, going into Florida when that was still Spanish. So he saw the War for Independence as a kid. He had been a lawyer, a judge, a representative, a senator twice. He had been a soldier in the War of 1812 and invaded Spanish land and grew to be a rich plantation owner, all before he was president. More drama. When he was running for his presidency, he was right off of his Senate seat in 1824. He won the popular vote, but no candidate had enough electors, and so the election went to the House of Representatives, and they followed the Constitution and ended up deciding the election for John Quincy Adams, similar to some modern elections where there is a difference between the popular vote and the number of electors. Jackson ran again 4 years later in 1828, and that began his presidency. He started the party that would eventually become the modern Democratic Party. With that win, he became the first U.S. president from a state that was not Virginia or Massachusetts. He survived being shot in a duel. He let the other man shoot first. This was a little before he was president, and then he killed the other man with his shot. He was involved in a number of duels in his younger years, and then while he was president, he survived the first assassination attempt of a sitting U.S. president. His vice president, John Calhoun, came from South Carolina, and the main income source at the time in the United States was a tariff on imports from Britain. The tariff funded 90% of the U.S. government, but it also hurt cotton prices. And so Mr. Andrew Jackson's Vice President Calhoun had opposite positions from Jackson. And he spoke out against this anonymously. And then it ended up being him speaking out against his own president in speeches and writings in their re-election year. And he threatened secession to the point that warships were sent to Charleston Harbor, and Calhoun resigned his vice presidency seat and was elected as senator to represent his state and serve their interests, even though they're opposite from the president. The tariff disagreement was resolved, but not very amicably. Mr. Andrew Jackson was one who believed that other people could be enslaved and removed from their land as long as their needs were met. He owned hundreds of slaves over his life. He removed multiple Native Americans from their while in the army, including tribes that he had allied with to defeat common enemies. Jackson continued to order the removal of natives when he was president. When gold was discovered in Georgia, he signed the Indian Removal Act, leading to what became known as the Trail of Tears. He expanded this approach during his presidency. Over 70,000 native people were forced off their lands from the south, all the way up to New York and the Great Lakes, and all were moved west of the Mississippi. This made him really popular with white voters because it gave them lots of new land for farming, mining, etc. Jackson is also the president who expanded the Supreme Court from 7 to 9 justices. He believed in the power of the people and not the elite, so that is why he did a whole bunch to open up new lands and expand the Supreme Court and various others. But to our story about the gold rush, Jackson did not like paper money or IOUs or promissory notes. He believed in paying off debt and that gold and silver were the only real money. And so Jackson was able to accept payment in the form of debt, but the person went bankrupt and Jackson was never paid with real money. And because of this acceptance of debt as payment, he nearly went bankrupt himself. So he is the only president to end up paying off the entire national debt. He did that in 1835. Next video will look at how he did that and the impact. But it was discovered in the U.S. state of Georgia in 1828, and the second gold rush in the United States ever was on by 1829. The first USA gold discovery had been in North Carolina in 1799, but here was another gold find, and tens of thousands of miners flooded the state, leading to the gold lottery of 1832, where they awarded land to incoming miners. The way they could do that is because the people who already lived on the land, the Cherokee Indians, were forced away on what became known as the Trail of Tears. A mint was established in Dahlonega, and they made gold coins here until the Civil War. How does it relate to our story? A few Americans learned how to mine gold here and eventually came west. Jenny Wimmer was present at the gold discovery, and she learned how to identify gold here and helped James Marshall confirm that it was real. Also during Jackson's presidency, Mexico was a pretty new country, having become independent in 1821. Lots of changes occurred in that first decade, from positives like outlawing slavery in 1829 to really rough changes like severe financial and political turnover. 13 years later, the new Mexican president Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna dissolved their entire Congress in 1834, and he was determined to rule with an iron hand. And so that leads to the Texas Revolution. English-speaking Americans living in East Texas wanted self-government, and they wanted slavery, so they launched a rebellion. Tired of ineffective Mexican government and the 1829 abolition of slavery, English-speaking residents of Texas rebelled, and they were intent on something else. Most English-speaking residents preferred annexation by the USA, but the U.S. Congress couldn't figure out a way to allow so much slave-owning territory in the United States. And that informed the famous defeat at the Alamo. But there was eventual victory, and the Texans were steadily defeated by the professional Mexican army. But major conflict ended in 1836 with one decisive battle won by the Tejanos and General Sam Houston's army at San Jacinto, with the capture of Mexican general and the president, Santa Anna. U.S. President Jackson recognized Texas as an independent republic, no longer a part of Mexico, in one of his final acts in 1837. But those independent Texans continued to skirmish and fight with the Mexicans for years until eventually the U.S. annexed the territory in 1845. And that led to the Mexican-American War, which eventually led to this gold rush. To review, Jackson really believed in the common person. He believed not just in the elite. This included removing the money power and people who had a lot of money, and we'll look at the consequences of that next time. There was lots of drama and change during his life and his 8 years as president. He set two pieces on the stage. One piece was the Georgia Gold Rush, and that gives us two things: modern gold mining in the United States, and the precedent was reinforced that Native Americans can be kicked off their land when Americans find valuable resources. Another piece that Jackson set on the stage was Texas. This is the beginning of that story, but the next 12 years are filled with those skirmishes, and the Texans want independence, and it all ends up escalating to the Mexican-American War in 1846. Next level questions. What was happening in your area in the 1837? Give a comment and let us know below. Thank you very much, and we appreciate learning about the past, and I hope that you can use this knowledge to make a better future. Thanks for watching.